In the last video, we set up the state for our animations and we set up the sprite sheet. And so now we're going to, we've already actually created a couple of animation clips too, but we're going to set up the state machine so that we can transition between animations, which is going to be important for your game. We had this idle state, and we also had this, I think originally I called it dying state, but I went and looked it up, and it turns out this is taking damage, which is why it looks kind of funny. And so one quick note, if you can't access anything, it's probably because you didn't click on the object here. And once I do that, I'll be able to access the taking damage sprite. And so I'm going to hit play just to see what happens. And it looks kind of weird. And the reason is that this animation just has 2 frames. And so it's cycling through them. But at the end of this frame, it jumps back to the beginning. And so he just sort of flickers really quickly, which is not what we want. The way to get around this is just to go back to this state and duplicate this sprite at the end. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's see, I think it's this sprite here. I'm going to just drag this over here. And then I can take this key and I can move it to the middle and then move this one to about 20. And then when I play it, he looks a little bit more normal. That's still kind of funny looking, so I can adjust it in real time to just sort of see what it looks like, and then this gives him a little bit less time between this transition here. And since we're transitioning from this sprite to this same sprite really quickly, like we don't see any difference, so it's okay to add the extra frame here. Let's do one for what is called mining, I believe. I think it's supposed to be the idea, or like attacking basically, and it's going to be two state animation also. So I'm going to create a new clip here, and I'm going to call this mining. And then I'm going to take these 2 frames and I'm going to drop them in. And I'm going to just stretch out the time a little bit. Something like that. Hit play to see what it looks like. And I can barely see what's happening. Even if I make it longer. Oops. Make it longer. I grabbed the wrong time there. It's still a similar thing, right? I can really have a hard time seeing what's going on. So we have to do the same thing, which is to create, go back to the initial state again, drop it in here, take this key frame, stick it somewhere in the middle, around 15, and now we can see he looks like he's mining. I kind of like it. That's okay. From an artistic perspective, you might want to change when these animations happen. So I would probably move it a little bit closer to here so it looks like he sort of whacks it and then pulls back his mining pick really quickly. Okay, so that animation is set up. But now we want to set this up in code so that it actually works. And I'm going to close up my little thing here. We're basically done with this part. And the way we're going to do that is, of course, by adding a script. So I'm going to add a component. And yes, I'm just going to type new script here, if I can spell. And then I'm going to call this scavenger input. So in theory, that got created probably not where I wanted. So I'm going to drag it over to my folder here. This is my scavenger input, and we should have it set up. The one thing I want to do is add a new input type that's going to be called mining. So I'm going to go to my project settings. If you didn't dock your project settings, you can always go to Edit and then Project Settings here. But this will just open up my project setting here. And I already have one of these, so I'm just going to delete it and recreate it so you can see how that happens. So if I just reduce the number to 19, then we're good. It deletes it. And then if I just change it to 20, it's going to duplicate the last item. And here I can rename it. And so I'm going to rename this to mining. And then the key I'm going to use is going to just be the space bar. That seems like an easy key to hit. This is also mapped to something called jump, but I don't really care about jump because you can't really jump. I could delete that or rename it as I would choose, but I'm just going to create a new input axis here. So we're going to call this mining. I'm using the space for it, and the rest of this doesn't really matter. That should be fine to get the inputs that I need. Okay, so go back to my inspector. Now I'm going to double click on my scavenger input, and we're going to create some code for this. Now, one of the tricks that we often do is that we want to get a hold of the component, another component on our object. And the way we do this is through a function called getComponent. And there are these little angle brackets that we have to use, and we have to put the component name in here. This is sort of a type-safe way to do this. And so the component I want to access is called the Animator. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just save a copy of that just to make it easier to reference later in my code, so I'm not having to do get component constantly. And so I can see it visually in the editor. I'll just make it public. So Animator, and we'll just call this Animator like that. And then I'll say Animator equals get component Animator. Okay, that just sets that up. The other thing I might want to get is my Sprite Renderer, so similar thing. I can do this also, Sprite Renderer. Now, you don't have to do this, obviously. You can just set up your, it used to be that actually the game object had all of these predefined, but they realized it was kind of a waste to do that. So they're no longer doing that, but, it just makes your code a little bit cleaner looking in some places. So do it as you see fit, I guess is my recommendation. Now in update, what I want to do is get the input of the mining button so I can switch axes, so I can switch animations. But let's see how to do that with the state machine. If I come back over here to my game and I go to the window, I can then click on animation and then go to Animator. And it's going to bring up these states. And these are different states. It's a finite state machine, so we have these arrows that sort of tell us when we're going to get from one state to the next. Entry is basically where when the game starts, it's going to start at the entry state, and it's immediately going to go to the idle state. This idle state is the one that we created at the beginning. And now we want to have a state that's going to transition from idle to mining. The way that we do that is we right-click on idle, and we say Make Transition. And when we do that, we'll get this arrow. My computer is kind of acting slow here. We'll get this arrow that we can drag around. And then we'll click on mining here. And this will attach it. So we will now be able to go from idle to mining. And we're going to want to transition back from mining to idle. So I'm going to click it on there. And I can click on the individual arrows, and this will give me some rules for when the transitions occur. And in order for this to occur, what I want to do is create what's called an animation parameter. So I'm going to click on my parameters here, and I'm going to hit plus, and I'm going to make a bool parameter, and I'm going to say, going to call it is mining. And the little checkbox, I can use it for debugging, and if I click it, it'll set that to true, and then I can watch what happens in the animation state over here. So I need to set up conditions for when this transition happens. So I click on the arrow, and then on this set of conditions here, I'm going to click, and it's going to pull up one of my animation parameters, which I can get. I only have one of them, and I'm going to say yes, it's true. This will cause it to transition to mining state, and then I'm going to set one up to go the opposite way, which is when is mining is false. Okay, now I'll be able to set those parameters from code. The other thing that I want to do is open up my settings here, because by default it's going to have some transition time to go from one animation to another. But because this is sort of like a 8-bit looking style game, then I want to get rid of some of this stuff. So I don't want an exit time. Well, I can just unclick that. And then my transition duration, I want to be 0. All right, and the same for returning. I don't want an exit time, and my transition time will be 0. This will allow me to immediately switch to the state and then switch back. So let's go back to the code now. So now I can say if animator And the reason I do that is because initially when the game starts, if there's some reason that the animator is not set, then I don't want it to have I don't want it to crash. So I'm just testing to make sure that it was set. But generally, because it's happening in start, by that point the animator should be created. So it's just sort of a, safety programming, I guess. All right. So if animator, I'm going to say if input get button mining equals true, then I'm going to say animator set bool, oops, not poem location, set bool is mining to be true. Else animator set bool is mining false. All right, so this will allow it to set that bool value, which will then go back and forth. If you're wondering about this green line, it's because I think that there was something that was already inherited for renderer. So, let's just get rid of that just so it looks pretty, since we won't need it. All right, let's try going to our game, see what happens. We need to go into game mode. We're in the idle state, and I'm going to hit the space bar. Oh, look at that. Looks like I am, doing some mining now. All right, the other thing that we can do is we can get some user input along the horizontal axis to switch the direction that this sprite is facing. If you look in your sprite renderer, you'll see this flip option. If I click on the X, you'll see that it flips the other way. And in fact, as long as it's flipped the other way, then all of my sprites are going to rotate the other way, because this sprite is getting replaced by my animations. So what I want to do is go back to my script, and I'm going to use the horizontal input. So if input get axis horizontal, if it's greater than, say, 0.01, then I'm going to say renderer it's not going to like that, so we'll just use get component sprite renderer. After I changed it, I tell you, get component flip x equals true equals false. In the default version, it faces to the right, and being greater than 1 is like they push to the right for the horizontal axis. So else if input get axis horizontal is less than negative 0.01, get component sorry about that, component sprite renderer flip x equals true. So this will reverse the orientation of that sprite. So now if I come over here and I stop it and then restart it, it's going to recompile the code, load it up. And then if I try to move to the left, we'll see that my sprite switches. If I move to the right, we'll see that he switches around. And so that's how we set up these values. Now, like I said, you can add other animations of properties that you want to add, and you can add them through these values here. And then we can basically say like what we're going to animate, and we can set up keyframes to animate any one of those things. So whether it's color or flipping or anything that we have on here, we can end up animating through the animator. And then we can set up those states up here by determining what's going to happen. Now, one thing that you might want to do is be able to debug what's going on in your state. So I'm going to sort of minimize this so that I can see my game state. And now when I push my spacebar, what you'll see is that my mining state has switched. And when I let go, we'll see that it pops back. So it's sometimes good to have your animator up on the same screen as your game so you can see what's happening when you're getting user input. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you.